The night was long and hot. Alice lay on the snow-white sheets. Her breathing had not yet recovered from the stormy act of love. Nearby, on his back, his hair scattered across the pillow, lay her husband, stately, confident, slightly out of breath from recent ecstasy. His hand slid lazily along her thigh, but she no longer thought about him. She kissed his shoulder, whispering a quiet sleep, and then carefully, so as not to disturb her husband's sleep, slipped out of bed. The floor was cold on her feet as she walked towards the door, trying not to make a sound. The house was plunged into darkness. Only the dim light from the bathroom cast a faint glow in the hallway. Alice crept there, locked the door, and took a deep breath, feeling the fire flaring up inside her again. With trembling fingers, she took out her phone, unlocked it, and found the saved video. The screen flickered, and an image appeared on it, frank, provocative, exciting. She turned the volume down and leaned her back against the cool tiles of the wall. The eyes, slightly narrowed, followed what was happening on the screen. Every movement in the video resonated with her with inner heat. Alice closed her eyes, immersing herself in her sensations, allowing herself to dissolve in this moment without judgment, without fear of being caught. But suddenly something made her freeze. There is a faint sound outside the door, a barely audible footstep, or perhaps the slight creaking of boards. She held her breath, abruptly turned off the video and froze, listening to the silence of the house. Several seconds passed, but nothing happened. She exhaled slowly, opened her eyes, and looked at her reflection in the mirror. There was a woman in it that no one really knew, even her husband. Alice Matties is a 49-year-old woman, the head of a large technology company known for its revolutionary solutions in the field of artificial intelligence. She is used to controlling everything: business, employees, even her family. However, behind the facade of success lies something more complex. Her professional success is the result of years of dedication and sacrifice, but in her personal life, she increasingly feels an emptiness that neither money nor power can fill. Her husband, Jacob Mathies, 53, is a theater director whose productions have earned the respect of critics and audiences. He lives in the world of art, where every movement, every scene has meaning. Their marriage has spanned over 20 years, and they were once inseparable, inspiring each other to new heights. However, over time, their connection weakened, giving way to habit and alienation. Jacob often disappears into the theater, spending long hours in rehearsals, while Alice focuses more and more on her business, strengthening her empire every day. Alice and Jacob have two daughters, each of whom goes their own way. The eldest, 18-year-old Claire, recently entered a prestigious university and dreams of building a career in the art world. She is talented, independent, and at times rebellious against her mother, blaming her for being too controlling. Claire grew up watching her mother lead people with cold confidence and now dreams of proving that it is possible to achieve success without rigidity and manipulation. But deep down, she is afraid that over time she will become like Alice. The youngest, 14-year-old Emma, on the contrary, is closer to her father. She is passionate about theater and imitates Jacob, striving to follow his creative path. Emma spends hours in the theater watching her father create magic on stage and dreams of one day taking a place among the best actresses. Unlike Claire, Emma seems more flexible, but hidden pain often flashes in her gaze. She lacks her mother's warmth. She feels that Alice's career is more important than her family and desperately wants to be noticed. The Mathies family lives in a luxurious house surrounded by high fences and even higher walls of innuendo. Every morning begins with a perfectly planned schedule. Every meeting is reduced to formalities. Their life seems ideal, but behind this external picture lies a tension that no one wants to admit. They are accustomed to the role of an ideal family, but do not notice how the distance is growing between them. All this is just an outer shell that can crack at any moment. Alice, Jacob, Claire, and Emma each hide their fears, desires, and doubts, afraid to upset the balance that holds them together. But how much longer can they maintain this illusion of well-being? Alice Matties was born into a family where success was not just a goal, but the only acceptable option. Her father, Richard Wells, was a respected economics professor, and her mother, Evelyn, ran a chain of luxury boutiques. In this house, weakness was an unaffordable luxury, and mistakes were punished with contempt. From early childhood, Alice learned the main rule: if you want to achieve something, work harder than others and never show your emotions. She grew up surrounded by discipline and high expectations. Her parents demanded from her impeccable studies, the best results, and leadership wherever she could prove herself. She shone at school best grades, victories in competitions, admiration from teachers. However, behind this success lay loneliness. Friends were more like rivals, and childhood was a series of endless attempts to meet other people's standards. Her relationship with her mother was particularly difficult. Evelyn saw in her daughter an extension of herself, a projection of her unfulfilled hopes. She taught Alice that what matters in this world is not feelings, but power and status. The girl is used to praise, but only for achievements. A simple, "I'm proud of you," sounded only after new victories. Alice did not know affection, tenderness, or real maternal care. Instead of bedtime stories and cozy conversations by the fireplace, she received stern parting words, cold assessments of her progress, and constant indications of what could still be improved. My father, on the contrary, was a man of ideas, but rarely paid attention to his family. He was always immersed in work, research, and calculations. His interest in Alice only showed when she showed an analytical mind or an interest in business. He taught her to think strategically, but did not give her an understanding of how to build relationships with people. So she learned to win respect, but not love. He often discussed with her management theories, global economic trends, and prospects for the growth of digital technologies. But when it came to personal experiences, he became alien and distant. From an early age, she knew that her future had to be exceptional. She not only dreamed of power, she felt that she was created for it. At the university, Alice studied business administration, then graduated with honors from her master's degree. Even then, she stood out for her ambition and ruthlessness. Competitors in educational projects quickly realized that it was useless to argue with her. She saw the goal and walked towards it, not paying attention to the doubts of others. She was feared and respected at the same time in the group. Teachers cited her as an example, and recruiters from the best companies hunted for her even before graduation. The first step in my career turned out to be fateful. Her analytical mind and ability to make risky decisions quickly propelled her up the career ladder. At age 35, she was already running a large technology startup, and by age 40, she headed her own company. She achieved success, but every year she realized, the higher you rise, the fewer people you can trust. Over time, Alice began to understand that her impeccable image and professionalism were repelling people, creating a vacuum of loneliness around her. Now, running a major technology corporation, she realized that her life was the embodiment of all the lessons she learned as a child. She could control the market, employees, and competitors. But could she control herself? In moments of silence, when work retreated for a while, doubts began to torment her. It seemed to her that she was standing on top of a huge glass building, the fragility of which was felt with every step. She built an empire, but did she remain the master of her destiny, or did she become a hostage to the ambitions that had been instilled in her since childhood? Alice always considered herself a woman who achieves everything herself, but in her youth, she, like many, believed in the idea of love. She was 24 years old when she met Daniel, a charming, confident lawyer who worked at a prestigious law firm. He was a little older than her, seemed mature, wise, and knew how to speak beautifully. There was something about him that made Alice feel special, even protected, something she had missed so much as a child. Their romance developed rapidly. Daniel looked after her, gave her expensive gifts, and took her to the best restaurants. He knew how to listen and was delighted with her ambitions. In him, she saw a reliable partner, a person who could be her support. A year later, they got married. At first, everything seemed perfect. Alice was building a career, and Daniel supported her, saying that he was proud of her success. However, over time, their relationship began to change. Alice noticed that her ambitions frightened him. He wanted his wife to be softer, more feminine, and devote more time to home and family life. But Alice was not ready to give up her goals. Quarrels became more and more frequent. Daniel accused her of being cold, of thinking only about work. He tried to control her, to force her to conform to the traditional role of a wife. Alice felt that she was suffocating, that this marriage was a cage in which she could not be herself. 3 years later, she realized that she could no longer live like this. Divorce became inevitable. They parted without scandals, but with disappointment. Daniel finally told her, "You will never be truly happy with anyone. You are too passionate about yourself and your career." Alice didn't answer. She simply left, determined that she would never again allow anyone to define her life. A year has passed since the divorce, and Alice threw herself into work. She no longer believed in romantic ideals, believing that love was an illusion that prevented her from achieving her goals. Her career was gaining momentum, and she convinced herself that this was enough. Work became her refuge, the only place where she could feel in control of her life. Every morning she woke up, made a to-do list, and moved forward tirelessly, trying not to think about the emptiness that sometimes made its way into her heart. But fate decided otherwise. They met at a charity evening organized by a foundation for supporting young entrepreneurs. Alice didn't particularly want to be there, but attending such events was important for her reputation. Among the guests, her attention was attracted by a tall man with expressive eyes and a confident smile. He didn't try to impress anyone around him. His confidence was natural. His posture, calm look, light smile, everything about him spoke of a man who knows his worth, but does not need proof. His name was Jacob Matthies. A famous theater director, he lived in a completely different world, the world of art, emotions, and creative inspiration. Alice immediately realized that he was different from everyone she knew. Unlike other men, he did not try to compete with her, did not try to put her below him. On the contrary, he admired her intelligence, strength, and ambition. When their gazes met, Alice felt a strange excitement, a feeling that she had not experienced for a long time. Their first conversation lasted longer than expected. They talked about theater, business, philosophy, and dreams. Jacob talked about his work, how the magic of the stage is built, how the theater lives and breathes. Alice, despite her pragmatic mindset, found herself listening to him with genuine interest. He spoke as if he was painting pictures with words, and there was so much sincere passion in his words that she wanted to become a part of this world. For the first time in a long time, Alice felt that she could just be herself, without trying to meet anyone's expectations. Jacob saw in her not only a successful woman, but also a person with passions, fears, and doubts. She didn't need to be convinced that she was strong. He knew it and accepted it. He was not afraid of her independence, did not try to control or remake her. In his eyes, she remained who she really was. Their relationship developed rapidly, but this time without illusions. They did not build castles in the air and did not idealize each other. They knew that life is not only about romance, but also about difficulties, compromises, and working on oneself. Alice understood that Jacob was her equal. He didn't try to change her, but on the contrary, he inspired her to be even stronger. A year after they met, they got married. It was a modest but warm celebration, unlike what she had once dreamed of. This time she knew. This marriage was her conscious choice and not an attempt to meet other people's expectations. When she said yes, it wasn't a hasty decision, but an acceptance that she had finally found her man, a man who didn't try to tame her, but loved her for who she was. Years passed, and Alice could say that she had everything that any woman dreams of. Her life looked ideal: a successful career, respect from colleagues, a devoted and loving husband, 2 wonderful daughters. There was harmony in their large house at first glance. Morning breakfasts with the whole family, weekend trips out of town, social evenings, where Jacob invariably held her hand, showing everyone how much he appreciated her. Her colleagues admired her ability to balance work and family, considering her an example of a modern woman who has achieved balance. But somewhere deep inside, a strange emptiness settled. At first, Alice did not attach any importance to this. She convinced herself that it was just fatigue, temporary stress. However, every day the feeling of dissatisfaction became stronger. One day, sitting in her office, she looked out the window, watching people rushing about their business. At some point, she became unbearably bored. Is this really her life? Is it all already painted down to the last detail? Alice could not understand what exactly she was missing, but the feeling that she was missing something did not leave her. Neither a long family life, nor a luxurious lifestyle, nor a job in which she was proud, nor cosmetic procedures designed to preserve her youth could compensate for her lack of emotional intimacy and physical satisfaction. She felt that something inside her was fading away, as if part of herself remained unrealized. She began to wonder, when was the last time she did something solely for herself? When was the last time you felt real excitement and excitement? Her life consisted of planned meetings, obligations, but did she have passion? She turned to the mirror and saw a strong, confident woman in the reflection, but there was something missing in her eyes. Alice didn't know where this feeling would lead her, but she knew one thing. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had to change. Everything changed in an instant. Normal morning, usual route. Alice went to work, immersed in her thoughts. The city lived its own life. Cars rushed through the streets, people hurried about business, lights from shop windows and advertising billboards flashed everywhere. She enjoyed the cool morning, breathing in the air filled with the aromas of coffee from street cafes and wet asphalt after the night's rain. Her world was structured and predictable until an unexpected incident took her out of her usual rhythm. She heard a sharp bark and turned her head to see a large dog rushing straight at her. My heart sank. In a split second, all possible scenarios flashed through my head. A bite, a fall, panic. She instinctively stepped back, but at that moment a calm, confident voice rang out. "Wait." And the dog, as if obeying an undeniable command, suddenly braked. A young man stood in front of her. Tall, with a slight squint of attentive eyes, he radiated calm and confidence. With just one movement of his hand, he called the dog away, who immediately froze, obeying him without a leash. Alice couldn't help but hold her breath as she watched this. Something about his hard but smooth movements fascinated her. She could not take her eyes off his hands precise, without fuss, easily controlling the situation. "Everything is fine?" he asked, meeting her gaze. Alice felt like she should say something, but she was speechless for a moment. His confidence, strength, slight indifference, everything about him was completely different from what she was used to seeing in the men around her. His calmness was not ostentatious, and the power he had over the animal was felt almost physically. For the first time in a long time, someone made her feel different. "Yes, thank you." That was impressive, she finally managed, realizing that her voice sounded quieter than she would have liked. He chuckled slightly, but didn't say a word. Instead, he simply nodded and slowly walked on, and the dog obediently followed him, as if an invisible thread connected them. Alice stood looking after him. Usually, she quickly recovered from unexpected moments, but now she felt slightly dizzy. Her mind tried to analyze why this incident had such a strong impact on her, but all she could comprehend was the overwhelming feeling that, from this moment on, something would change. She looked at her hand, the fingers of which were still trembling from adrenaline, and suddenly realized this was not only an unexpected meeting, it was a sign. In the evening, returning home, Alice tried to behave as usual. Dinner, conversations with children, familiar family rituals, everything was in its place, but her thoughts wandered somewhere far away. The image of a young man could not leave her head. His voice, the tough but calm movements, the moment when he effortlessly took control of the situation. It was all imprinted in her mind, as if on a film, repeating itself over and over again. She tried to distract herself by immersing herself in family conversations. "Mom, did you hear what I said?" Claire, her eldest daughter, suddenly asked. "Sorry, honey." "Repeat, please," Alice replied, forcing herself to return to reality. "I said that we would have a charity evening at our university, and Dad promised to come." "Can you do it too?" There was hope in Claire's voice. "Of course, I'll try," Alice smiled, although she really wasn't sure she had the strength to pretend. At that moment, Jacob placed his hand on top of hers. "You're kind of thoughtful today," he remarked, looking intently at her. "I'm just tired," she replied, quickly removing her hand. But fatigue was only part of the truth. A strange tension burned in her body, a thirst for something forbidden that she could not explain. All evening she felt a hot pulse inside her, barely holding it back. When the children had gone to their rooms, she walked up to Jacob, slid her hands over his shoulders, and kissed his neck. "Do you want me?" He grinned, hugging her. "Yes, I want to," she whispered, hoping that physical intimacy would return her control over her emotions. They had sex. His hands were gentle, his movements were familiar, almost mechanical. Alice closed her eyes, trying to imagine what she had felt before, when their intimacy filled her with fire. But this time something was wrong. Her body did not respond to his caresses, and every second only increased her disappointment. She thought about the other man, about how easily he controlled the dog, about his confident gaze. She felt that she was losing herself in this obsession. "Everything is fine?" Jacob whispered, sensing her distance. "Yes, just tired," she answered quietly, hoping that he would believe. Afterwards, he fell asleep, as usual, quickly and calmly. Alice lay there for a long time, looking at the ceiling. Her breathing was even, but a storm was raging inside. The desire has not disappeared. It only grew. Quietly getting out of bed, she sneaked into the bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the water to muffle the sounds. With shaking fingers, she touched herself, closed her eyes, and let her thoughts return to that moment on the street. Stop. Her mind replayed this moment over and over again. His voice, confidence, rough but precise gestures. Her breathing quickened. She moved faster until she finally felt released. When it was all over, Alice pressed herself against the cool tiles of the wall, trying to calm her wildly pounding heart. Her body relaxed, but her mind remained confused. "What's wrong with me?" she whispered to herself. She couldn't understand what was happening to her, but she knew one thing for sure. This man had launched something in her that would no longer give her peace. Alice could not know that fate had already prepared a new meeting for her. The next day, as usual, she walked into her company's spacious office, ready for her morning meeting. Work rhythm and structure had always given her a sense of control, but today was different. Her assistant, Lauren, walked into the office, holding a tablet with the day's schedule in her hands. She looked at Alice, frowning slightly. "Alice, a group of new trainees have already gathered in the conference room," she said. "You should get to know them, especially Dan Rains. According to preliminary reviews, he is one of the most promising candidates." Alice nodded, straightening her jacket, and headed there. She was used to these introductory meetings, new young, ambitious people wanting to impress her with their knowledge and zeal. Most of them were predictable, enthusiastic, but easy to read. However, one of them immediately stood out from the rest. He stood at the end of the room, a little to the side, as if he was watching what was happening, but was in no hurry to take the initiative. Tall, confident, but relaxed, he showed neither fear nor reverence. His eyes, calm and persistent, looked straight at her, but there was not the slightest submission in this look. He looked at her as an equal, as if he saw her not as a boss, but as just a person. Alice felt her internal rhythm falter. She couldn't explain why, but his presence unsettled her. He didn't do anything out of the ordinary, didn't try to attract attention, just stood there with his hands in his pockets and watched her with an uneasy, implacable calm, as if he knew her better than he should. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain a professional mask. "Welcome," she said, looking away and trying to speak confidently. "I'm Alice Amades, General Director. I hope that your time here will be a rewarding experience for you." She quickly scanned the list of interns, but her attention returned to him again and again. The name she was looking for appeared naturally. "Dan Rains," she read aloud, as if checking to see if the sensation matched reality. "Yes," he answered calmly, without looking away for a second. There was silence in the room for a second, an almost palpable tension filling the air. Alice felt a slight chill run over her skin. She quickly looked away and continued getting to know the others, but something inside her had already changed. This young man was already changing her life, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. Alice tried to convince herself that her impression of Dan was an accident, a simple effect of surprise. But every day she became more and more convinced that this was not so. He really was different. Unlike the other interns, he did not try to please, did not ask questions in order to impress. He was simply present, observing, and his confidence was almost palpable. The day after their first meeting, Alice ran into him again in the office. It happened in the corridor as she was heading towards the meeting room. Dan came out of the next office and stopped as soon as he noticed her. He was in no hurry to give way, in no hurry to lower his gaze, as other employees did. He just stood and looked at her directly, openly, without a hint of submission. Alice felt her breathing hitch for a moment. She had never encountered such behavior from someone who was lower in status than her. Even those who tried to appear confident sooner or later gave in, but not him. "Have a nice day," she said dryly, trying to add a slight detachment to her voice. Dan just nodded slightly, without a hint of a smile, and left. Alice continued on her way, but something shrank inside her. Was it irritation, curiosity, or something more? All day she tried to concentrate on work, but her attention kept returning to the morning meeting. Dan Rains didn't just unsettle her, he upset the balance she had so carefully built over the years. During an evening meeting, when Alice was speaking to top managers, out of the corner of her eye she noticed Dan enter the room and sit down at the end of the hall. He shouldn't have been here, but no one dared to tell him that. For a split second their eyes met again. He looked at her calmly, without unnecessary emotions, but there was something in that look that sent shivers down her spine. She immediately looked away, pretended not to notice him, and continued talking. But the words were harder for her than usual. Alice didn't know why this particular person made her feel different, but she understood one thing for sure. With Dan's appearance, something in her began to change. Alice was sitting in her office, looking through reports, when the door opened slightly and her assistant Lauren entered the room. They had worked together for several years, and Alice had long appreciated her professionalism and dedication. In addition, they developed a relationship of trust, a rarity in the corporate world. "Alice, can I have a moment?" Lauren asked, closing the door behind her. Of course, something urgent. Alice took her eyes off the screen and motioned for her to sit down. "Yes, it concerns interns," Lauren answered, opening the tablet. "As part of the mentoring program, you were assigned one of them for weekly meetings. This is Dan Rains." Alice raised her eyebrows, but quickly pulled herself together. "Is this necessary?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "You know that this is part of the company's personnel development initiative," Lauren smiled. "Each top manager supervises one trainee, answers questions, and shares his experience. Usually this is once a week, but if you want, I can try to give it to someone else." Alice hesitated. She could refuse, but then it would look strange. Moreover, Dan did nothing to displease her, except for his confidence, which unsettled her. "No, it's not worth it," she finally said. "If he's part of the program, then so be it." "Great. Then I'll schedule the first meeting for Friday," Lauren replied, and, after hesitating, added, "By the way, I wanted to discuss something else. I know this is completely off topic, but I heard that the board of directors is considering appointing a new head of strategy. And, to be honest, I would like to submit my candidacy." Alice looked at her with a slight smile. "I was just thinking about this," she admitted. "You deserve this for a long time, Lauren. I will help you get this position." Lauren nodded gratefully, but then added hesitantly, "Are you sure everything is okay? You seem stressed lately." Alice hesitated. Lauren knew her too well. But now was not the time to say that her thoughts were not occupied with work, but with something completely different. "There's just a lot to do," she answered briefly, "but thanks for noticing." The assistant beamed, and Alice suddenly felt a slight sense of relief. Talking to Lauren helped her regain control of the situation, at least for a moment, distracting her from thoughts about Dan. But now, knowing that they would have to interact regularly, she felt that this balance might be upset again. When Lauren left, Alice leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The thought of having to spend time alone with Dan every week made her strangely uneasy. These are not just work meetings. She felt that every interaction with him could push the boundaries of her self-control. She opened her eyes and looked out the window. She needed to prepare. She had to convince herself that this was just an intern and not a person who had already begun to destroy her familiar world. Alice sat at her desk, tapping her fingers on the wooden surface. She tried to concentrate on work, but the thought of the upcoming meeting with Dan could not leave her head. Her office was always a zone of control for her, a place where she set the tone and rules. But today there was a strange feeling that this time everything would be different. There was a light knock on the door, and a second later Dan entered. He was in no hurry, moving confidently, but without challenge. His eyes lacked the usual deference that she was used to seeing in young employees. He sat down opposite her and looked expectantly, in no hurry to speak first. There was something strange in this pause that made her heart beat a little faster. "How is adaptation going?" Alice asked, hoping that her voice sounded even. "Quite interesting," he replied, raising the corners of his lips slightly. "But it seems to me that I can get much more information from you." Alice clenched her fingers. He was too confident for an intern. Usually young employees were nervous in front of her and chose their words carefully. Dan acted as if they were on the same level. "Fine." She made a note in her notepad to keep her hands busy. "What questions do you have?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I'm interested in how you make important decisions." He spoke calmly, but there was something more than ordinary curiosity in his voice. "What is your main motivation?" Alice met his gaze. She knew it was a standard question, but his tone made her feel like he was digging deeper than he should. "Logic and calculation," she answered clearly. "I never make decisions influenced by emotions." Dan chuckled slightly. "Never?" he asked, tilting his head. Alice hesitated for a moment. He didn't doubt her words, he challenged her, tested her boundaries. A tense silence hung in the room. "In business, no," she said firmly. "Feelings should not influence strategy." Dan shifted slightly in his chair, continuing to watch her. His next phrase came unexpectedly. "I think you like being told what to do." Alice tensed. Her breath caught. His comment was so inappropriate that she didn't immediately find what to reply. She wanted to wave him off, laugh, put him in his place, but she couldn't. He didn't ask. He claimed. And she understood that there was truth in his words, which she was afraid to admit to herself. She quickly looked away and straightened up, trying to regain control of the situation. "That's a highly inappropriate comment, Dan," she said coldly. He didn't look away, didn't apologize. There was absolute confidence in his eyes. Alice felt her fingers grip the handle a little tighter, and at that moment she realized that he did not need to manipulate. He simply saw her as she was. "You like control, but something tells me you're getting tired of it," he added after a pause. Her breathing hitched. Now she didn't just want to stop talking, she wanted to disappear, to run away from this thought, because he said something that she had never said out loud. Alice rose sharply from her chair. "The meeting is over," she said. Dan slowly stood up, still looking at her calmly. "Of course," he said simply. When he left, Alice remained standing, looking into space. Her hands were shaking. He said it so casually, so simply, as if he had read it, as if it were obvious. She ran her hands over her face, took a deep breath, and looked at her reflection in the glass. For the first time in a long time, she saw something other than control in her eyes, something that scared her. Alice returned home later than usual. All day she tried to focus on business, but her mind kept returning to the meeting with Dan. His words, his look, his confidence, all this left a mark on her that could not be erased. And now, standing in the silence of her bedroom, she felt something new. Her body seemed tense, but not from stress, from desire. It burned her from the inside, preventing her from thinking clearly. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt such excitement, such hunger. She walked into the bathroom, turned on the water, and looked at her reflection. Her eyes sparkled. Her breathing was a little deeper than usual. She ran her fingers down her neck, over her collarbones, slowly realizing how much she wanted to be touched. Not just the usual closeness, but something else, something that she always lacked, but that she never dared to say out loud. Scenes that she was afraid to formulate in words surfaced in her thoughts. Greater submission, losing control, complete dissolution in someone else's will. This idea was so forbidden that its very essence seemed something sinful. Alice shuddered and hastily turned off the water, as if hoping that the cool silence of the bathroom would drown out these thoughts. When she came out, her husband, Jacob, was already in bed, looking at the news on his tablet. He looked up at her and smiled. "You're late," he remarked, putting the device aside. Alice slowly walked up to him, sat on the edge of the bed, and slid her palm over his chest. "I miss you," she whispered, leaning closer. Jacob looked at her in surprise. She rarely took the initiative, and when this happened, everything was predictable, within the framework of the usual ritual. But now there was something different in her eyes. "You want?" He faltered, but she had already circled her fingers around his shoulder, slowly moving down. "Yes," she answered, "but let's try differently." She offered him a game, something new, something that went beyond their usual intimacy. Her voice sounded even, but fear raged inside her, the fear that he would sense her insincerity, her inner struggle. "A game?" Jacob chuckled, raising his eyebrows slightly. "You intrigued me. What are you suggesting?" Alice hesitated, choosing her words. How to explain to him without revealing the whole truth? She wanted him to guide her, to force her to obey, but at the same time she was afraid to even imagine such a request. "Maybe you can take control," she finally said, watching his reaction. Jacob smiled, but his touch was familiar, predictable. He turned her over onto her back, kissing her neck gently as he moved down, but that wasn't what she wanted. He did everything right, but too softly, too carefully. He didn't understand her forbidden desires, and she couldn't bring herself to say them out loud. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine something else for a moment. A different touch, a different power. She imagined how her body obeyed, how she didn't need to control, didn't need to be strong, how a voice full of power whispers to her what to do. But even in her imagination, she did not dare to fully imagine it. These desires were top secret, too forbidden to even mentally acknowledge them. When it was over, Alice lay next to Jacob, looking at the ceiling. He fell asleep quickly, contentedly, unaware that there was still tension in her body that he could not relieve. Quietly getting out of bed, she crept into the bathroom. Closing the door, she took a deep breath, pressed her forehead against the mirror, and closed her eyes. "What do you want?" she whispered to herself. She felt trapped between who she should be and what she really wanted. Alice walked into the office holding the phone to her ear. She was intently discussing the details of the upcoming deal. Her voice was even but firm. Stopping at the reception desk, she nodded to the secretary and continued the conversation. "No, we can't wait until the end of the month. I want the report on my desk by evening," she said, stepping towards the coffee area. She turned around and at that moment collided with Dan. He stood too close, and their gazes crossed for a split second. There was that feeling in his eyes again. Not of submission, but of something more dangerous, a full awareness of his own influence. He didn't look away, didn't take a step back, didn't show the usual deference she'd seen from the rest of the staff. "Make me some coffee," she said automatically, hoping her voice sounded firm. Dan raised an eyebrow slightly, but nodded. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked towards the kitchen. Alice felt her heart clench. She hurried into the office, throwing the phone on the table and closing her eyes for a few seconds. She didn't understand why his presence threw her off balance so much. Her skin burned where their eyes met. She wanted to brush it off, write it off as an accident, but something inside her continued to hum, like tremors in the air before a thunderstorm. A couple of minutes later, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," she said, straightening up. Dan walked into the office, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. He placed it in front of her, not taking his eyes off her. There was the same confidence in his movements that irritated her and attracted her at the same time. His presence filled the space, making her feel like the air in the room had become thicker. "How did you calm the dog down then?" she asked to fill the pause. He chuckled slightly. "Gave her cookies." Alice blinked. It sounded too simple. "That's all?" Dan leaned a little closer, his gaze mocking but tenacious. "Shall I give you cookies too?" he said evenly. For a few seconds, she was speechless. His words were challenging, and he knew it. There was a tension in the air unlike anything she had experienced before. She should have stopped him abruptly, put him in his place, but instead her heart made a strange leap. She looked away, trying to maintain composure, but she felt the skin on the back of her neck tingle. He did not move, continuing to look at her as if he read her thoughts. "All?" she asked dryly, trying to regain control. Dan chuckled slightly and stepped back, but as he turned, he accidentally hit the pen stand on her desk with his elbow. They scattered across the floor, scattered in a chaotic disorder. Alice sighed, about to call one of the assistants, but before she could say a word, he calmly said, "Pick it up." His voice was smooth, but not a request, it was an order. She looked at him. He didn't smile or openly provoke her. He simply said it as if it were a given. She should have been outraged. She should have put him in his place. But her body reacted faster than her mind. She slowly bent down and began to collect her hands, feeling his gaze on her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed them back into the holder. At that moment, her breathing hitched, and for a moment it seemed to her that the whole world had narrowed down to the two of them. When she raised her head, Dan had already turned to leave. "Have a nice day, Alice," he said calmly as he left. She remained sitting in silence, still feeling the heat of his gaze on her skin. Her heart was beating too fast. She couldn't believe that she had just obeyed his order, and the worst thing is that she liked it. She slowly ran her hand over her lips, as if trying to erase any remaining tension. What's happening to her? Why did she let this happen? She stood up abruptly and took a couple of steps around the office, trying to even out her breathing. We need to forget. We need to continue living as before. But as soon as she closed her eyes, his voice flashed in her memory again. "Pick it up." Alice knew that this would not be the last time he overstepped his bounds. And the worst part was that she wasn't sure if she wanted him to stop. Alice tried to behave as usual. Work meetings, calls, reports, everything went as usual, and no one could suspect that chaos was going on inside her. But the more she tried to repress thoughts about Dan, the more they penetrated her consciousness. This annoyed her. She was angry that she had allowed herself to be subjugated at that moment, and what scared her most was that she liked it. She was sitting in a regular meeting, making notes on a notepad, when she felt eyes on her. Raising her eyes, she met him. Dan sat at the end of the hall, leaning on the back of a chair, looking straight at her. He didn't turn away, didn't pretend to be busy with something else. He watched. I was waiting. Alice clenched her fingers on the handle. Someone was speaking in the room, but the words became background noise. All she could hear was the beating of her own heart. She shouldn't have let this happen, shouldn't have reacted, but her body betrayed her before she could stop herself. She looked away and returned to her notes, but the letters blurred before her eyes. Tension grew in her chest, as if she was standing on the edge of something unknown and dangerous. After the meeting, she headed to her office, hoping that being alone would help her calm down. But as soon as she closed the door, there was a knock. "Come in," she said, expecting to see Lauren. But it was him. Dan entered the office, holding a folder with some documents in his hands. He moved towards her desk with the same lazy confidence that threw her off balance. "You need to sign this," he said, placing the papers in front of her. Alice forced herself to take them, but when she reached for the handle, he also extended his hand. Their fingers touched for a moment. She shuddered. It was so fleeting, so insignificant, but she felt it too keenly. It was as if an electric shock passed through her skin. She looked at him. He didn't remove his hand right away. His fingers lingered on her wrist for a moment, a light, subtle touch, but enough to make her hold her breath. "Are you nervous?" he suddenly asked. "What?" Alice removed her hand and clenched her fingers into a fist. "You're tense," he explained calmly, as if he was making a routine observation. "Is it because of me?" She laughed short, coldly, to hide what she really felt. "Don't flatter yourself, Dan. You're just an intern." He tilted his head slightly to the side, watching her. "Is it true?" There was something in his voice that made her freeze. He didn't seem upset by her words. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy her resistance, knowing that beneath the surface it was already bursting at the seams. She swallowed and looked at the documents. "You can go." "Of course," he answered, but did not immediately move towards the door. Instead, he leaned slightly towards her, leaning on the table. "But before I go." He paused. Time seemed to stretch. She felt his proximity, smelled him a light aroma of woody notes, warm and viscous. "Tell me if I'm wrong," he continued, looking into her eyes. "But it seems that you like to play control, although something inside you wants something completely different." Alice tensed. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. He said it so casually, so simply, as if he had read it, as if it were obvious. She had to answer something. Should have stopped this. But her body betrayed her again. She could not move. Dan straightened up and stepped back. "Have a nice day, Alice," he said with a slight smile and left, leaving her alone in the office. She sat motionless, feeling a shiver run down her spine. What the hell just happened? And why did she want this to happen again? Alice tried to switch. An evening with her family was supposed to restore her sense of stability, erase the tense conversation with Dan from her memory. She sat at the dinner table across from Jacob and her daughters, forcing herself to smile and participate in the conversation. "Mom, did you hear?" Claire suddenly asked, leaning closer. "Sorry, what?" Alice blinked, realizing that she had not listened to her at all. "I said that we will have an exhibition at our university." "I would like you to come," the daughter explained. "Of course, honey," she nodded, taking a glass of wine. The phone lying on the table nearby vibrated. Alice took a quick look, a new message. She opened it almost mechanically. "Dan, are you thinking about me?" Her heart trembled. She quickly turned off the screen and took a sip of wine, feeling the tension wash over her. "Everything is fine?" Jacob asked, noticing her hesitation. "Yeah, just work issues," she lied, forcing herself to smile. The conversation at the table continued, but Alice hardly listened. The vibration of the phone caught her attention again. "Dan, there is no need to pretend that this is not so." She took a deep breath. He continued. He knew he was throwing her off balance. Alice couldn't afford to answer, but she couldn't just ignore it either. Each sound of the message was like an electric shock. "Dan, you want me to stop? Or not?" Her fingers tightened on the table. She pretended to read the news feed, but did not open the dialogue. She simply left the phone face down, trying to focus on her family. After the exhibition, they decided to take a walk in the park with the whole family. The day was warm, the air was filled with the aroma of fresh leaves and flowers, and a light breeze played with your hair. Jacob walked ahead with his youngest daughter, discussing something cheerfully and casually. Alice walked next to Claire, feeling that she wanted to tell her something important. "Mom, can I talk to you?" Claire finally asked, shifting from foot to foot. Alice looked at her daughter and nodded. "Of course, honey. Did something happen?" Claire took a deep breath, looked away for a moment, and then, gathering her courage, said, "I'm dating a girl. Her name is Emily and I love her." Alice stopped, comprehending what she had heard. Claire looked at her with alarm, as if expecting condemnation or misunderstanding. But instead, Alice smiled softly and took her hand. "Claire, the most important thing to me is that you are happy. If Emily makes you happy, that's all that matters." "I'm proud of you," she said, squeezing her hand lightly. Relief flashed in Claire's eyes. She smiled faintly, and the tension that had been holding her all this time disappeared. "Thank you, Mom. I was very afraid to tell you." Alice ran her hand through her daughter's hair and hugged her. "Never be afraid to be yourself," she whispered. They walked on, now hand in hand, and Alice felt that, despite her own internal anxieties, At that moment, she had done something truly important. Alice tried to avoid Dan. She stopped going into the area where the interns were working, changed her usual route around the office, even instructed Lauren to reschedule several meetings just to minimize any chance of running into him. Her mind said one thing, keep her distance, but her body reacted differently. Every time she accidentally noticed him in the corridor, in the meeting room, or even in the reflection of the glass walls, something tightened inside her. Her breathing hitched for a moment, and her fingers involuntarily clenched into fists. She tried to convince herself that it was just a physical reaction to stress, that she is irritated by his self-confidence, his ability to read her at first glance. But the truth was that his presence brought out something more in her, something she was afraid to admit, and yet it was impossible to avoid it completely. As part of the mentoring program, they were required to meet once a week, and Dan didn't seem willing to let her ignore that rule. The first time she canceled the meeting, citing urgent matters. In the second, she moved it, hoping that he would forget. For the third time, Lauren quietly reminded her, Alice, Dan is waiting for you in the meeting room. You've already rescheduled the meeting twice. This may look weird. Alice clenched her teeth. Yes, it did look strange, but even stranger was how strongly she was drawn to him, despite all her attempts to resist. She closed her laptop and took a deep breath. Fine. I'm coming, she said in an even voice. She tried to walk slowly, to collect her thoughts, but with every step her heart beat faster. What will she tell him? How can he pretend that nothing is happening? She must be strong and control herself. She opened the door. When she entered the meeting room, he was already waiting. He sat leaning back, confident, relaxed, as if he knew she would come. There was tension in the air. He didn't say a word, just watched her, and that was enough for her to feel an electric charge running through her body. I was already beginning to think that you were avoiding me, he said, tilting his head to the side. I have a lot of work, she answered reservedly, sitting down opposite him. Of course, he nodded, slowly twisting the handle on his fingers. But that's not the only reason, right? Alice clenched her fingers on the table. He was right, and she hated it. Let's get down to business, she said firmly, trying to ignore the strange unrest in her stomach. To the point. Dan smiled and leaned forward. Do you want me to ask questions about work? Fine. Why are you here? She frowned. What? Why this particular job? Why this position? His voice sounded even, but there was something searching in his gaze. You like control, right? She clenched her jaw. Of course. Any leader must keep the situation under control. What if control slips away? He said it quietly, but every syllable resonated inside her. Her breathing became a little more rapid. She looked at his hands, folded calmly on the table, then back into his eyes. You're starting to overstep your bounds, Dan. And you let me do this? He retorted, without looking away. She didn't answer. Her throat was dry. He read it again like an open book. Have a nice day, Alice, he said finally, but did not move. She stood up first, and only when she closed the door behind her did she allow herself to exhale. Her knees were shaking. She took a few steps down the hallway, trying to regain her composure, but one thing was clear. This wouldn't be the last time she tried to escape from him, and not the last time she was drawn to him. Days passed, but Dan did not retreat. He continued to text her, called her, and although Alice never answered, it didn't stop him. She didn't open his text messages, but every time the phone screen lit up, her heart started beating faster. She tried to act as if nothing had happened. I immersed myself in work, spent time with my family, planned meetings, but the internal tension only grew. She knew that he was somewhere nearby, she knew that he was waiting for her reaction, but she did not give it to him. At night, she lay in bed, listening to the steady breathing of Jacob as he slept. The room was filled with silence, but a storm was seething inside it. She closed her eyes, but could not sleep. The moments of their meetings popped up in my head again, and again his voice, his gaze, his confidence, his ability to see right through her. She hated him for it, and at the same time, she longed for it. Sometimes she reached for the phone, hovered her finger over the screen, but every time she forced herself to put it back. She couldn't afford to take this step. She couldn't let him know that his presence had taken over her thoughts. But every minute, every day, this denial became more and more fragile. Lauren was finally able to convince Alice to go to the event. It was a charity evening in one of the most luxurious restaurants in the city. Guests in expensive clothes, champagne in thin glasses, laughter and soft live music, everything was created so that people could feel part of something significant. Jacob and his daughters accompanied her, and everything had to look perfect: family, status, work, social interaction. But Alice knew that Dan would be there. When they entered, her gaze involuntarily found him among the guests. He was standing at the bar, talking to someone, but she knew he saw her. His presence was almost tangible, as if a heavy wave was covering her headlong. He didn't come up right away, didn't say a word to her, but his look said more than hundreds of sentences could say. "Relax, Alice." Lauren leaned closer, pushing her towards the table. "It's just an evening. Drink some wine and enjoy the moment." Alice nodded and took the glass, but her hand trembled slightly. She tried to concentrate on the conversation with her colleagues, listen to what Jacob was saying, but her thoughts were directed only in one direction. She felt his gaze, even without looking in his direction, and knew that he was watching. Dan was in no hurry. He waited. He knew that sooner or later their paths would cross. And the moment came when she went out onto the terrace to catch her breath a little. The cool air cooled her hot skin, but the relief lasted only a second. "You finally came," Dan's voice came from behind. Alice closed her eyes for a moment before turning around. He stood in the shadows, but his confident posture, slight grin, and gaze penetrating into the very depths were too obvious. His suit fit perfectly, but he looked different from the rest of the guests. There was no fuss, no ostentation. He just was. Confident, calm, completely in control of the space. "This is an important event," she answered in an even voice, trying not to show tension. "Certainly. But you feel uncomfortable." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sounded like an order. "Have another drink, relax. Or, I can help." He came closer, but did not touch her. He shouldn't have. His power over her was already felt in the air. She felt her body react before her mind could give the command to resist. "You're too self-confident." Alice tried to smile, but her voice didn't sound as firm as she would like. "Really?" Dan bowed his head slightly, watching her. "I think you like it." She took a deep breath, tightening her grip on the glass. She knew she should leave, turn around, and return to her family, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "Not here," she whispered. "So, in another place?" He grinned, taking a step back, but without taking his eyes off her. Alice didn't answer. She turned and quickly walked back into the hall, to Jacob, to Lauren, to her role. But even among many people, she felt that he was still there, waiting, waiting. She knew it was just a game of time. Alice continued to avoid Dan. After the evening at the restaurant, she felt that their interaction was becoming too dangerous. She found reasons to cancel weekly meetings, rescheduled them, loaded herself with work, just so as not to be alone with him. But Dan wasn't one to give up. Early in the morning, as she sat in her office, sorting out documents, the phone vibrated. Message: "Dan, you are avoiding me. This is not an option. Let's meet today, in my hotel room." Alice squeezed the phone in her hand, feeling her heart skip a beat. He didn't ask. He reported. She quickly put the phone in her desk drawer, pretending that nothing had happened. But chaos raged inside. She had to do something. Something that would give her back control. She couldn't let him continue this, couldn't let him think he could manipulate her. This must end. In a hurry, without thinking, she headed to the theater where Jacob worked. She knew that he was there now, rehearsing a new production. She needed to see him. Remind herself of who she was before the chaos Dan brought into her life. When she entered the hall, the stage was flooded with warm light. The actors were practicing scenes, and Jacob stood in the center, explaining something with emotional gestures. He was always passionate about his work and gave it his all. She looked at him and tried to feel something relief, peace, familiar affection, but all she felt was anxiety. Alice. He noticed her and, raising his eyebrows in surprise, walked towards her. You didn't call, I thought you were busy. I just decided to pop in, she answered, feigning lightness. I wanted to know how your day was. Jacob smiled and began to talk about his production and the difficulties the troupe faces. Alice listened, but hardly heard. Her thoughts were far away, her body was here, but her mind was already on the way to the hotel. Half an hour later, having found an excuse to leave, Alice left the theater and headed to the car. She got behind the wheel and, clenching her fingers on the steering wheel, drove to the hotel. She won't let him continue. She will tell him straight out that it ends here and now. When she entered the building, everything went cold inside. She knew she was making a mistake, but she tried to convince herself that she was going there for someone else, in order to put an end to it. Walking up to the front desk, she said her name. Here's your key, miss, the receptionist said with a smile, handing her the card. Alice took it, took a deep breath, and headed towards the elevator. Dan was waiting for her. Alice entered the elevator, feeling her fingers tightening her grip on the key card. A whole hurricane of emotions raged inside her: anger, fear, impatience, but most importantly, determination. This must end. She will tell him directly. We'll end this game. The elevator stopped softly and the doors slid open. She went out into a narrow, dimly lit corridor, walked past the rooms, counting the numbers on the doors until she reached the one she needed. Cheap hotel. Worn walls, faded carpet. Not where she expected to see Dan. Not a place she would ever come to on her own accord. She took a deep breath and inserted the card into the electronic lock. Click. The door gave way, letting her inside. The room was simple, even poor: a small bed with a dark blanket, a lonely table with a cheap lamp, a shabby chair by the window. There was neither luxury nor comfort here. Just a cold, neutral background that doesn't carry anything personal. But he wasn't there. Alice walked deeper into the room, feeling the silence pressing on her. She sat down on a chair, crossing her arms over her chest. The weight irritated her even more. He called her here, and where is he now? She looked at the phone. No messages, no calls. Only her own reflection on the screen, a tense face, dark eyes, lips compressed into a thin line. She waited. The door opened. Alice turned around sharply. Her heart skipped a beat. Dan entered the room as calmly as always, closed the door behind him, and looked at her. There was no surprise in his gaze, more like satisfaction, as if he knew that she would come anyway. "Oh, you're already here," he said, grinning. Alice clenched her fists, stood up from the chair, and pointed to the bed. "Sit down," she said sharply. He raised an eyebrow, but complied, slowly lowering himself onto the edge of the mattress. She stood in front of him, crossing her arms over her chest, trying to suppress the trembling inside. "This is wrong, Dan." Her voice was firm, but everything inside was shrinking. "You have to stop this. Stop sending me messages. Stop calling. Stop acting like you have power over me." He watched her, his gaze studied her, but he did not interrupt. "I'm married, I have a family, a job. I can't. I won't let you interfere in my life." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, and this angered her even more. Dan bowed his head slightly, continuing to listen silently. The atmosphere in the room became increasingly dense, and Alice felt that, despite all her words, control was slipping out of her hands. "This is wrong, Dan," Alice repeated, trying to keep her voice firm. "You have to stop. Stop sending me messages. Stop calling. Stop acting like you have power over me." Dan didn't answer immediately. He slowly leaned back, resting his hands on the bed, and looked at her with that same expression that always unsettled her: calm, almost lazy, but inside of which there was something inexorable. It was as if he saw right through her. "But you came," he finally said, his voice low and even. "Nobody forced you." "I came to finish this," she snapped. Dan nodded as if in agreement, but there was no remorse in his eyes. He studied her, slowly moving his gaze from her tense face to her clenched fingers. So you want me to disappear? He asked. Yes, she said sharply. He nodded again, but stood up. His movement was smooth and controlled. He moved closer until there were only a few centimeters between them. Alice should have retreated, but did not. She stood still, feeling his proximity, his warmth, his smell. Are you sure? His voice became quieter, but this only penetrated deeper under the skin. Dan. She swallowed. You don't understand. No, you don't understand, he interrupted, his voice sounding soft, but at the same time firm. You can say you want to end this, but your body says differently. Alice felt how everything inside her tightened. He did it again. I saw in her what she was trying to hide, something she was afraid to admit. It's not like that, her voice was almost a whisper. Dan slowly raised his hand, but didn't touch it. He just left her in the air, close but not touching. Alice felt her breathing quicken. She understood that she was now on the verge. One step, one movement, and everything will change. Tell me to leave, he whispered, and I'll leave. But she was silent. Alice felt her stomach tighten as Dan looked at her intently, as if weighing her next reaction. The silence in the room was so thick that it seemed to swallow the air. Get on your knees, he said quietly, but his voice sounded like a clap of thunder. Alice blinked, taking a step back, not believing she heard it. Her breathing hitched. What? Her voice broke. Get on your knees, he repeated calmly, as if not seeing anything strange in his request. She shook her head, taking another step back. Everything inside protested, shouting that this was beyond the bounds of what was permitted. I can't afford that, she said, trying to keep her voice confident. Dan didn't move or change his expression. He was just waiting. Then leave, he said calmly. Alice clenched her teeth. She turned around, heading towards the door. Her steps were fast, firm. She reached out her hand to the handle, but stopped. Everything inside was burning with tension that wouldn't let go. Her hand was shaking. She closed her eyes for a moment. And then she turned around and slowly walked back into the room. Dan was still standing in the same place, calm, waiting. Alice took a deep breath, knelt down, and felt the world around her narrow down to one look, one moment. She obeyed. Alice was on her knees, her breathing was ragged, and her heart was pounding in her chest so loudly that it seemed to drown out everything around her. Dan was silent, but his silence was worth more than 1,000 words. He looked down at her. His gaze was firm, calm. Confidence. Take off your clothes, he said finally. She shuddered. The words spoken so simply, without emotion, burned her mind. She should have been indignant, should have jumped up, pulled him back, left. But her body did not move. Something deep inside her constrained her will. The voice broke. I can't. But you want to, he didn't ask. He claimed. Alice clenched her fingers, her mind desperately searching for a way out, but her own desires entangled her, depriving her of strength. She felt like everything she had built over the years, control, power, confidence, was crumbling into dust. She never allowed herself to be weak. She never let anyone control her. But now, here, in this room, under his gaze, she felt different. Her hands shook as she reached for the buttons. She didn't know why she was doing this, but she knew she couldn't stop. He watched, calmly, without haste, without pushing her. Alice felt her body covered in goosebumps, not from the cold, but from something unknown, scary, and frighteningly attractive. As the fabric fell at her feet, Dan nodded slowly. Stand in the corner. She blinked, not understanding. For what? Just do it. She hesitated. It was absurd, it was humiliating, it was. She turned around and took a step. Then another one. Her skin burned, her breathing became shallow. She stood with her back to him, feeling the space around her shrinking. Her mind screamed that this was wrong, but her body wanted to continue. She closed her eyes, and at that moment he came closer. His touch was light, but it was enough to break something inside her. Dan was in no hurry. His movements were confident and precise. Alice felt herself losing control. Her breathing quickened. Her body responded to every touch. She couldn't believe she was experiencing this. This moment tore apart all her ideas about herself, about her life, about her power over her own desires. When a wave of pleasure washed over her, she clapped her hand over her mouth, trying to control herself, but it was impossible. Her mind insisted that this was wrong, but her body lived a different reality. She gasped, shocked by what had just happened. She slowly opened her eyes, her gaze blurred. She had never felt anything like this before. Even with my husband, Jacob could never bring her to this point. She looked at Dan. He knew. He saw it in her eyes. Alice was shocked. But what scared her even more was that she wanted more. Alice was no longer the same woman as before. Something inside her broke, changed, reshaped her. She was accustomed to power, control, to the fact that all decisions in her life depended only on her. But after that night, everything became different. She didn't resist anymore. Now she knew what it meant to obey. What does it mean to let someone else take control? And the worst thing is that she liked it. Sitting in the car, heading home, she looked at her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. My thoughts were confused, memories of what happened flashed in my mind again and again. She felt strange, but not guilty. No, she felt free. As she pulled into the garage and turned off the engine, her heart suddenly began to beat faster. She had to enter the house, return to her usual life, to her husband, to her children, to herself. But who is she now? Alice took a deep breath and finally got out of the car. She felt the ground shaking beneath her feet, as if her old life was no longer as stable as before. She returned home, but something inside her told her that the real her remained there in the hotel, on her knees in front of Dan. At work, they remained who they were supposed to be. Alice is a confident, tough boss who makes decisions and keeps everything under control. Dan is an intern who carries out assignments and follows the chain of command. Their gazes might have crossed paths in the hallway, but nothing gave away what was happening outside the office. But after work, everything changed. Once the office doors closed behind her, Alice was no longer the formidable woman running the business. She was submissive. She was waiting for his call, his instructions, his commands. She came where he ordered. She did what he wanted. Her body was no longer hers, it was his. She couldn't explain why she liked it so much. Why submission gave her more freedom than control. Why was it that every time he told her what to do, her body responded with a wave of pleasure? And the more she immersed herself in it, the more she realized that there was no turning back. During the day, she was alone. At night, it's different. And she liked it. When Alice entered the house, her heart sank. Her family was sitting at the dining table in the living room. Jacob, Claire, youngest daughter, and Dan. He smiled, chatting easily with her husband, as if he were an old family friend. Alice froze in the doorway, her breathing ragged. Panic began to rise from within, spreading through the body in cold waves. How did he get here? What is he doing in her house? Alice, you're finally home, Jacob said with a smile. Your intern stopped by to give you a laptop. You forgot it in the office again. Dan turned his head and looked at her. His gaze was calm, but there was something more inside it. Something that made her legs feel weak. Yeah, I thought it was important, Dan said evenly, holding her laptop in his hands. Alice didn't know what to answer. She stood in the doorway, feeling the walls of her double life begin to crumble right before her eyes. Alice sat at the table, trying to remain calm. Dan kept talking to her family, and the worst part was that they liked him. Jacob laughed at his jokes. Claire asked questions about his work, and his youngest daughter simply looked at him with curiosity. Alice felt panic growing inside her. It was necessary to get rid of him as quickly as possible. Dan, it's probably time, she said, hoping he'd get the hint. What are you talking about? Jacob immediately objected. We were just discussing our trip over the weekend. Maybe Dan will come with us. Oh yes, that would be cool. Claire picked up. One more person in the company won't hurt. Alice clenched her fingers in her lap. She felt controls slipping out of her hands. Dan, of course, did not answer right away. He looked at her, his gaze full of hidden challenges. I wouldn't like to intrude, he said with a polite smile. Come on, you're our guest. Jacob waved his hand. The more, the merrier. Alice felt her heart clench. It was the worst thing that could happen. The weekend came faster than Alice expected. She hoped to the last that something would change, that Dan would change his mind or refuse, but he, of course, did not. The trip passed in tense silence. While Alice's family animatedly discussed the route, purchased supplies, and loaded things into the car, Dan simply watched without showing any emotion. He kept aloof, but that didn't make him any less noticeable. Now they were all out in nature. Jacob and the girls had already set up camp, lit a fire, and were laughing merrily, discussing plans for the evening. Alice sat in the car, watching them through the windshield. Soon Dan was next to her. "It's a good family," he said calmly, without looking at her. Alice didn't answer. She clenched her fingers on the steering wheel, trying not to show how everything was trembling inside. "You're nervous," he continued. "Is it because of me?" She turned her gaze to him. His face was impassive, but there was mockery in his voice. He knew the answer, but he wanted her to say it out loud. "Leave me alone, Dan," she said quietly. He smiled at the corners of his lips, but did not move. Her family's laughter could be heard outside, but there was tense silence inside the car. Alice nervously tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, trying to collect her thoughts. Her heart was pounding wildly, and everything inside was clenching with horror. How did this even happen? How did he end up here, next to her family, among people who suspected nothing? She turned to Dan, her gaze filled with worry. "Why did you come to my house?" she asked sharply, her voice sounding louder than she expected. "Why did you come here? On this trip? What are you trying to do?" Dan looked at her calmly, but a spark of irritation flashed in his eyes, which he tried to hide. "Do you really care?" He grinned. "You know the answer." Alice shook her head, trying to clear away the growing panic. She felt like she was losing control, like the reality around her was becoming unsteady and elusive. "You're playing with fire, Dan." Her voice trembled. "I have a family. This is all I have. I can't lose them because of you." His gaze became colder. He looked at her, studying her, waiting for her to say something else. Silence filled the space between them, tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "So this was all just a game for you?" he asked. His voice sounded dull, restrained, but there was an underlying anger in it. Alice looked away, unable to withstand his intense, almost accusing gaze. "I—" Her lips trembled, but she pulled herself together. "We should stop seeing each other. Besides work, everything must end." Dan tensed his jaw, his hands clenched into fists. He inhaled slowly, as if holding back the storm within himself. For the first time in all this time, he looked as if he had not expected these words. He was used to managing the situation, but now everything was collapsing, and not through his fault. "Is that what you decided?" His voice was quiet, but there was no mockery in it. "Do you really think you can just write me off? Pretend that nothing happened?" Alice closed her eyes for a second, trying to collect her thoughts. She didn't know if she could actually do it, but she had no other choice. "Yes," she answered firmly. "This needs to be finished. Now." Dan looked at her for a couple more seconds, then nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. He abruptly opened the car door, stepping outside. "Got it," he said briefly. Then he slammed the door, leaving Alice in complete silence. She closed her eyes, resting her head on the steering wheel, her breathing coming in short gasps. She had just taken the only right step, so why did she feel like she had just lost something important? Several days passed, but something changed. Dan no longer sought her gaze, did not send messages, did not appear next to her when she did not expect it. He didn't do anything to remind her of himself. He simply disappeared not physically, but emotionally, as if he had put an invisible wall between them. At work, he behaved smoothly and professionally. When she gave him tasks, he calmly listened, nodded, completed them, but did not ask unnecessary questions and did not stay longer than required. His gaze no longer sought her, and if they accidentally bumped into each other in the corridor, he passed by as if she were an empty place for him. This bothered Alice more than she cared to admit. She thought she would feel relieved, that her decision to end their relationship would bring her peace. But instead, she felt a strange irritation, an emptiness, as if something important was missing. One day, alone in the office, she picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could write to him, just ask something about work, just to see if he'll respond. But she didn't. Instead, she put the phone away and took a deep breath. She wanted this herself. She reminded herself. She made the point herself. Alice sat in her office, tapping her pen on the table. Their individual meeting was supposed to take place today, but Dan never showed up. She checked her phone, no messages, no explanation. It was strange. He always did his job, even after he started avoiding it. Finally, she called Lauren. "Do you know where Dan is? He missed the meeting." The assistant looked at her with slight surprise. "Didn't he tell you? He got a job in the evenings at a bar. Probably he just doesn't have time to combine it." Alice frowned. Bar. He didn't tell her about this. Something inside her trembled. Before she could stop herself, she was typing the address of the establishment into her phone. She didn't know why she was going there. Did she want answers? Did you just want to see him? The very thought that he could lead another life in which she was not present haunted her. When she entered the bar, she was immediately enveloped by the noise of voices, the smell of alcohol, and dim lights. She looked around, trying to find him among the crowd. But before she could ask anyone, one of the employees approached her. "You better leave," he said calmly, but there was no doubt in his voice. Immediately. Alice frowned, not understanding. "I came to Dan. I need to talk to him," she said firmly. The man shook his head. "He knows you're here, and he asked you to leave." Her heart skipped a beat. Alice froze, feeling how everything inside was shrinking. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. Dan himself asked her to leave. She felt an unpleasant feeling of emptiness growing, but without another word, she turned and walked out into the night, leaving the noise and smell of alcohol behind her. Now he was avoiding her for real. Alice couldn't concentrate all day. Thoughts about Dan haunted her. He avoided her, pulled away, and for the first time in all this time, he was the one dictating the rules. This made her angry. It excited her. This scared her to the core. Her fingers tapped nervously on the table. Her eyes darted across the laptop screen, but she did not see the words in front of her. Her mind was occupied with only one person. When the clock struck noon, she took a determined breath and pressed the button on her desk. "Lauren, call Dan to me." A few minutes later, the door to her office opened. He entered slowly, without unnecessary emotion, as if this conversation did not matter to him. He closed the door behind him and stood in front of her desk without saying a word. Alice felt the air in the room become heavier. He didn't even look at her the same way before. There was no challenge or mockery in his eyes, only cold detachment. "What happened yesterday?" Alice crossed her arms, trying to seem confident. Dan looked at her calmly. "Nothing. You have arrived. I asked you to leave. You're avoiding me." Her voice was even, but there was tension in it. He chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Isn't this what you wanted?" Alice clenched her jaw. She hated that he turned everything around like that. "I didn't ask you to disappear. I just wanted." "What did you want?" Dan leaned forward, resting his palms on her table. "Take control of the situation again. Stop it. We both know which of us is really in control here." Alice opened her mouth to object, but he didn't give her a chance. "Repeat that." His voice became lower, softer, but this made it even more powerful. "Say that you want it yourself. That you will do whatever I say." She froze. Her fingers clenched into fists. Her breathing became uneven. She couldn't say it. This would mean finally admitting your dependence on him. Dan walked around the table. I stopped nearby. She felt his warmth, felt the tension fill the air. "Speak, Alice," he whispered, leaning towards her ear. Her body betrayed her. It responded before the mind had time to give the command to pull away. When his fingers slid along her thigh, she flinched, but did not pull away. His hand slowly slid further, breaking all possible boundaries. "Speak," he repeated, and his voice now sounded like an order. Alice pursed her lips, her heart pounding. She hated him for taking over again. I hated myself for allowing this to happen. I, her voice trembled. I will do whatever you say. Dan pulled away slowly, his lips curling into a faint smile. Good girl, he said and walked out, leaving her alone with the chaos inside. Alice sank heavily into a chair, her hands trembling. She closed her eyes, but this moment appeared before her again and again. She lost. She finally gave up, and the worst thing is that she liked it. Their meetings continued. During the day, Alice remained cold and unapproachable, a boss who was respected and feared. But at night, when the doors closed, she became different. She lived in a world where she didn't have to make decisions, where control was not in her hands. Dan took control over her with the same ease with which she had previously managed her company. His voice was firm, his touch confident. He didn't ask, he ordered, and she obeyed. Every meeting was a revelation. Each night carried her deeper into this state of submission that filled her with both fear and delight. He demanded complete dedication from her, and she gave it to him, even if everything inside protested. She knew it was wrong. She knew she was playing with fire. But the forbidden fruit was too sweet, too desirable to refuse. Every time she left him, she told herself that this was the last time. But she came back every time. Claire's birthday was perfectly organized. Guests, decorations, expensive snacks, everything looked immaculate. Alice tried to control herself, smile, participate in conversations, be a good mother, a good housewife. She convinced herself that everything was under control. But everything collapsed the moment the door opened and Lauren appeared on the threshold. Lauren, and Dan stood next to her. Alice felt how everything inside her tightened. Her breathing hitched, her heart beat faster. She didn't expect this. Not here. Not now. Alice, Lauren called cheerfully, bringing Dan closer. I hope you don't mind that I brought a guest with me. After work, we decided to stop by together. Alice squeezed out a smile, but her hands trembled treacherously. Of course, she answered in an even voice, knowing full well that she had no choice. Dan looked at her. His expression was unreadable, but she knew he could see her confusion, sees and enjoys it. At that moment, Alice realized that control was finally slipping out of her hands. Alice couldn't stand his presence here. Her head was buzzing with thoughts, and inside everything was seething with anger and jealousy. How dare he? How could he come to her house, smile calmly, act as if nothing had happened between them? Her fingers frantically clutched her glass of wine as she watched him from afar. Dan spoke casually to Lauren, his voice sounding low, even confident. He wasn't just here, he was enjoying it. Alice felt panic growing in her chest, mixed with irritation. She couldn't look at it. She couldn't let this continue. Taking a deep breath, she headed towards the kitchen, knowing he was there too. When she entered, he was standing at the table, lazily leaning on the edge, as if he was already expecting her. His calmness only angered her more. Why are you here? Her voice trembled, but not from fear, but from rage. Dan looked at her calmly, tilting his head slightly to the side, as if studying her reaction. Lauren and I are dating, he said in a flat, emotionless voice, and his words hit her like an electric shock. Alice felt like everything was turning inside her. This was not true. It couldn't be. She didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. Her fingers clenched into fists, her breathing became ragged. No, she hissed, taking a step forward. I don't want you to be with Lauren. You are only mine. Dan raised his eyebrows, and then a slight, almost mocking smile played on his lips. Yours? He snorted mockingly. Did I ever belong to you? His words cut her to the quick. He mocked. He enjoyed her anger, her pain, her confusion. You belong to me, she repeated, her voice sounding harder than she felt. You know that. You feel it. I feel. Dan slowly came closer, his gaze becoming more and more searching. And you? Do you feel it, Alice? How are you feeling now? Anger? Fear? Or something completely different? She opened her mouth, but the words were stuck in her throat. She didn't know what to say. He was right. She felt everything at once: anger, desire, fear of losing control. At that moment, the door opened and Lauren walked into the kitchen. "Oh, there you are," she said cheerfully, not noticing the tension in the room. Alice twitched. Her hand tightened on the thin glass, and it slipped from her fingers. The glass hit the floor, shattering into hundreds of pieces. Lauren froze, her smile fading. "Alice, are you okay?" she asked carefully. But Alice could not answer. She looked only at Dan, and he looked at her. There was no surprise or fear in his eyes, only satisfaction. Silence hung in the air, broken only by her rapid breathing. The party has come to an end. The guests began to leave, saying goodbye to Claire and thanking Alice for a wonderful evening. The laughter and conversation gradually died down until the house was empty, leaving behind only the smell of birthday cake and a slight chaos: laid out plates, gift boxes, and half-empty glasses of wine. Alice, holding back her tension, collected several plates and carried them to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking. Everything that happened today could not get out of her head. Dan, Lauren, broken glass. His gaze penetrated into the very depths of her soul. Jacob walked up behind her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "Everything went great, honey," he said, kissing her temple. Claire was happy. Alice smiled, but the smile was forced. Her thoughts were far from family comfort. She nodded, continuing to mechanically clean up. "Yes, I'm glad," she squeezed out. But inside her everything was different. She felt that the holiday was just a mask. But the real storm was just beginning. It was a big day for Jacob, the main presentation of his film. Critics, colleagues, and family friends gathered in the hall. There was excitement in the air. People were talking and sharing their expectations. Alice sat in the front row, trying to look like an involved, supportive wife, but inside she was in chaos. The phone vibrated in her hands. She looked at the screen and felt her heart skip a beat. "Dan, I'll be waiting for you at the Eclipse Club. Don't keep me waiting." Her breathing hitched. She looked up at the stage, where Jacob was smiling as he answered questions from the reporters. This was his triumphant moment. She should have been here, should have supported him. But her whole body had already responded to Dan's call. She leaned towards her husband. Her voice was quiet, almost guilty. "Sorry, I need to go to work. It's urgent." Jacob looked at her in surprise, but seeing her tense expression, he only nodded. "Of course, if it's important." She forced a smile, squeezed his hand, and then, without waiting for him to continue, she stood up and quickly walked out of the hall. As soon as she was outside, her pace quickened. My heart was beating wildly. She knew she was making a mistake, but it was stronger than her. The car took off. She rushed towards the Eclipse Club, torn between duty and forbidden desire. Alice entered the Eclipse Club and was immediately enveloped by loud music, flashes of neon lights, and hot air saturated with a mixture of alcohol, sweat, and sweet perfume. The crowd moved to the beat, creating chaos that was both mesmerizing and frightening. She was wearing a luxurious dress that emphasized the curves of her body. Its smooth fabric slid against her skin as she made her way through the dense mass of dancing people. Her gaze darted around the hall in search of Dan, but the club lived its own life, drawing her into the whirlwind of its madness. "Drink," said a voice in her ear. She turned and saw an unfamiliar girl with bright scarlet lips holding out a bottle of water to her. Alice hesitated, but accepted the bottle and took a few sips. The liquid was cold, refreshing, but something lit inside it, as if the blood had suddenly become hotter. The girl smiled, cupped Alice's face in her hands, and approached. Their lips touched. It was unexpected, but Alice did not move away. Her mind seemed to drown in this moment, in this night, in this world without boundaries. When she opened her eyes, her gaze found Dan again. He danced among people, confident, relaxed, as if he was the master of this chaos. She felt herself drawn to him and began to make her way through the crowd, following this irresistible desire. The music vibrated within her as if it had become part of her very being. Alice danced, moving in rhythm with Dan. Her body was burning with heat, with sweat, with emotions that were tearing her apart from the inside. Everything around her dissolved. There was no past, no future, only this moment, only this chaos, which she allowed herself to be swallowed up. Dan pulled her closer, their bodies touching, moving in unison. She threw her head back, feeling him slide his lips along her neck, his hot breath burning her skin. Adrenaline beat in my temples, alcohol, and something else, unknown, poured through my veins. At one point, he took her hand and led her through the crowd, out of the chaos of the dance floor and into a quiet, darkened hallway. Alice didn't ask where he was taking her, she simply followed him, her heart beating wildly. The door slammed behind them, and suddenly everything was quiet. Finding themselves in a small, secluded room, where the light was dim and the air was thick, they found themselves far from prying eyes, alone with each other. She didn't think so. She simply allowed herself to lose herself in the moment. Alice was breathing heavily, leaning against the cold wall. The room was silent, only their breathing filled the space. The booming music coming from the club seemed like a distant echo of another reality. Here, in this enclosed space, there was only him. Dan stood opposite her, studying her with a look that mixed challenge and satisfaction. This moment seemed unreal to her, but she didn't want it to end. "Do you always play like this?" she asked, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded hoarse from the emotions she had experienced. Dan chuckled, tilting his head slightly to the side. "What do you mean?" His voice was low, calm, but there was something hidden in it. Alice ran her hand through her sweat-damp hair and straightened up. Her body was still trembling from tension, and her heart was beating faster than she would like. "With Lauren, are you doing to her what you do to me?" Her words sounded harsher than she intended. Dan stopped smiling. He looked at her carefully, as if he was weighing whether to answer. "No," he said finally. "That's why I behave differently around her." Alice felt something turn inside her. She wanted to hear this answer, but now that it was spoken, it scared her more than she expected. Her palms became damp, and her thoughts became confused. Why did this affect her so much? Why did she suddenly feel relief and at the same time new fear? "So I'm special." She wanted it to sound mocking, but her voice gave her away. He trembled, treacherously betraying emotions that she did not want to face. Dan took a step closer, closing the distance between them. He moved slowly, with the same calmness that always drove her crazy. He wasn't just getting closer, he was taking away her air, her space, leaving only himself. "You're not special, Alice," he whispered, touching her chin with his fingertips. "You're just mine." She swallowed, feeling his words swallow her whole. Deep inside her, something was torn apart, broken and reassembled into something new. At that moment, she realized that the point of no return had long passed. "Say it," his voice was quiet, almost hypnotic. She looked at him, her lips trembled, but she could not look away. Her body refused to obey common sense. "I'm yours," she whispered, barely audible. He smiled, and from this smile, everything inside her tightened. Dan leaned closer, his lips right next to her ear. "Good girl," he whispered. The days dragged on painfully long. Alice felt a heaviness growing inside her. Repentance was choking, shame was burning from the inside. Every time she looked into Jacob's eyes, she felt that she was lying not only to him, but also to herself. She's tired of hiding, tired of living in fear that everything is about to collapse. She couldn't eat, she didn't sleep well. Her hand shook when she poured herself morning coffee. When Jacob returned from work, she was sitting in the living room, clutching a glass of wine, but without taking a sip. Her shoulders were shaking, tears were streaming down her cheeks. He froze in the doorway when he saw her in this state. "Alice?" He came closer worriedly. "What's happened?" She sobbed, trying to collect her thoughts, but the words rushed out, burning her throat. I'm bad," she whispered, without looking up at him. "But I love you. Very." Jacob frowned, sat down next to her, and took her hands, but she did not squeeze his fingers back. "What are you talking about? What's happened?" She closed her eyes, feeling how everything inside was shrinking. Her body seemed to resist these words, but she could no longer remain silent. I never told you." Her voice broke, I've never experienced pleasure with you. Jacob pulled back, his fingers weakening. He looked at her in complete shock. What? His voice was almost a whisper. Alice sobbed, covering her face with her hands. She felt the ground disappearing from under her feet, how the familiar world was collapsing, but she continued. I I cheated on you, she finally breathed, but it was only once. I don't even know his name. It was just a stranger. I don't know what came over me. Dead silence reigned in the room. All that could be heard was their confused, heavy breathing. Jacob stood up slowly, his face contorted with rage. He walked around the room, clenching his fists, as if trying to pull himself together, but his emotions overwhelmed him. You risked our family for pleasure, he raised his voice, his eyes sparkling with anger. How could you? I didn't want to, she shouted back, jumping to her feet. It's not what you think. I'm confused. Confused? He laughed bitterly, but there was not a drop of fun in this laugh. Do you know what you just did? You just ruined everything. Alice shrank, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She took a step forward, trying to touch him, but Jacob pulled away, his gaze filled with pain and disappointment. I'm sorry, was all she could whisper, but she knew it wasn't enough. Sorry, he shook his head. You don't even understand what you did. He looked at her as if he saw a stranger in front of him, and at that moment a gap formed between them, which, perhaps, could no longer be overcome. Jacob silently grabbed his jacket and walked out the door without saying a word. Alice stood in the center of the living room, feeling the emptiness growing inside her. She destroyed everything. Her hands trembled, her heart sank with pain and remorse. She wanted to scream and run after him, but her legs wouldn't obey. Approaching the window, she cast an absent-minded glance into the yard and froze. There, in the dark, leaning against a street lamp, stood Dan. His silhouette was clear even in the twilight. He looked straight at her without looking away. Alice didn't hesitate. She ran out into the street. Her bare feet touched the cold stone, but she felt nothing. Having reached him, she grabbed his hand without saying a word and pulled him into the house. They walked in, and she immediately slammed the door, breathing heavily. Dan was silent, studying her with a look that mixed curiosity and a hidden grin. You knew this would happen, he finally said quietly. Alice ran her hand through her hair, trying to collect herself. I didn't know anything, she breathed. Everything got out of control. Dan came closer. His fingers slid along her cheek, burning her skin. This isn't the first time you've lost control around me. His voice was low, getting under your skin. She closed her eyes. He was right. Everything that happened between them went beyond the boundaries of what was permitted, but she could not stop. Do you want me to leave? His lips were a millimeter from hers. Alice opened her mouth, but before she could answer, a sharp sound came from behind her. She turned around and met Jacob's gaze. He stood in the doorway, his face distorted with pain and rage. He heard all. Silence hung over them, like an echoing abyss that now completely separated their worlds. Jacob took a step forward, his eyes blazing with anger. His gaze darted between Alice and Dan, as if he could not believe what was happening. You, he spat out the word with contempt, pointing at Dan. You dirty bastard. You're just a cheap manipulator who plays on weaknesses. Dan didn't answer. He just stood there, his expression remained calm, but his body tensed. He didn't look away. You destroyed my family. Jacob's voice trembled, but he could no longer restrain himself. You got into our house, got into her head. You're nothing. Alice raised her hands, trying to stop him, but it was too late. Jacob pushed Dan hard in the chest. He took a step back, but immediately straightened up, his face remaining stony. That's enough, Dan said quietly, but there was a warning in his voice. No, not enough, Jacob barked, swinging his hand. Everything happened in a second. Jacob struck first, his fist hitting Dan's jaw with all his might. Dan swayed but didn't fall. Instead, he moved forward sharply, pushing Jacob in the chest. They grappled, blows rained down one after another, The sound of dull blows and heavy breathing filled the house. Alice screamed, but they didn't hear her. They fought not only with each other, but also for something more, for power, for justice, for the truth that each of them considered theirs. At some point, Dan grabbed Jacob's hand, squeezed his wrist, and sharply pushed him back. Jacob collapsed onto the couch, breathing heavily. His face was scratched and blood was dripping from his lip. Dan wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and exhaled slowly. "Sorry," was all he said. And without looking at Alice again, he turned and left, leaving behind him the silence and ruins of their lives. The door slammed shut, leaving behind a deafening silence. Dan left, but the tension in the room did not dissipate. Alice slowly turned to Jacob. His chest was heaving, his fists were still clenched, his face was contorted with rage. "You," his voice broke, and he ran a hand over his face as if trying to pull himself together. "You just destroyed everything. Everything we had." Alice wanted to say something, but he didn't give her a chance. "Don't you dare," he pointed his finger at her. "Don't you dare open your mouth now. You're lying. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family." She sobbed and took a step forward, but he retreated. "Don't come near me," he barked. "How could you? What the hell were you missing? I gave you everything, all." "Jacob," her voice was hoarse, broken. I don't know why." "No," he punched the wall, making it flinch. You knew what you were doing, and still I went for it. Now what? Do you think I'll just forgive you?" She looked at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. He was right. It was all her fault, and nothing can be fixed. "Get out," he said coldly. His voice no longer trembled. There was an icy determination in it. "Get the hell out of my house. Right now." Alice froze. "Jacob, get out of here," he shouted, not allowing her to finish. She felt her legs become weak, but still forced herself to turn around. She walked into the corridor, automatically grabbed her bag, and threw her coat over her shoulders. Every step was difficult for her. When she walked out the door, the night seemed colder than ever. Alice left for the dacha, taking with her only the essentials. She took time off from work, saying she needed time to recover. Everything inside her was empty. In this house, surrounded by the silence of the forest, she tried to figure out what to do next. But instead of answers, I found only new questions. The days merged into monotony: walks along the lake shore, tea on the veranda, sleepless nights waiting for something that she herself could not explain. She felt lost. One afternoon, while she was sitting on the porch with a book, a car drove up to the dacha. Alice froze, her heart sank. Her eldest daughter got out of the car. "Claire?" Alice stood up, looking at her in surprise. Claire came closer, her eyes filled with warmth, but also with hidden anxiety. "Mom," she took her hand. "Dad misses you very much." Alice looked down, not knowing what to answer. Claire continued. "He wants you to come back. He said that he would forgive you, that you could try again. I know you miss me too, Mom." Alice took a deep breath, feeling a warm but frightening hope welling up in her chest. She wasn't sure if she deserved forgiveness, but maybe she still has a chance. Alice returned home. Jacob met her at the door, and a silence hung between them, filled with something new: understanding, forgiveness, the desire to start over. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, long and intently, as if he was studying her, trying to find the woman he loved. He finally took a step forward and hugged her tightly. Alice felt like the weight she had been carrying for the last few months had been lifted from her shoulders. She was home again. Everything was not the same as before. They both understood that it was impossible to return to the past, but it was possible to create something new. Their dialogues became more honest and frank. They were not afraid to tell each other about their desires, fears, and pain. This was reflected in their closeness. The bedroom was no longer just a place to sleep. They began to experiment, learn to re-understand each other's bodies, to look for what gave pleasure to both. For Alice, this was a revelation. Now she did not feel emptiness, did not feel the need to look for something on the side. She was finally being honest with herself and with Jacob. One day at dinner, as they sat in the garden, Jacob began talking about the future. "Do you think we can put this behind us?" he asked, taking her hand. Alice thought about it. She looked at him, at their house, at the garden filled with the smell of fresh grass. "I think we can try," she said quietly. Jacob nodded, squeezing her fingers tighter. There was understanding in his eyes. He knew that the past would remain with them forever, but the future depended on them. And Dan quit and left. Nobody knew where. He disappeared as suddenly as he appeared in her life. Alice didn't try to look for him. She sometimes caught herself thinking about him, not with longing, not with regret, but simply as a man who once turned her world upside down. Now he was just a memory, a part of the past that made her stronger. That evening, as the sun slowly dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Alice went out into the garden and breathed in the fresh air. Life went on, now on her terms.